Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay and I'm a military and naval historian. And this fall I've been going over the history of the development of military strategy and thought, tactics, and even hardware that is used. And this week we're going to cover air power as well as nuclear warfare. And for sorry for like program note, I know a couple of weeks ago I said I'd be back with this last week, but unfortunately I did catch a bug that was going through one of the schools where I substitute teach at, and I was not in any condition to record that video. But that being said, I'm going to make that up for you this week, and we will get going. So, as much as my mom dislikes Tom Cruise, he is a huge reason why that not only am I a naval historian, I am also in love with aviation. I should note every time I go to Washington, D.C., one of my favorite places to go is the National Air and Space Museum. And with that, also mentioned, before I came to find that submarines were a true and long lasting fascination of mine, it was naval aviation that first grasped my interest. And Top Gun is still one of my favorite films, and as well as his sequel, Top Gun Maverick. My parents were well aware of this when they learned of the U.S. Naval Sea Cadet Corps and were informed that the main unit in the Kansas City area, and still is the unit in the Kansas City area, was an aviation focused squadron and let me join that unit. In addition to having a full grasp of naval history, the chiefs leading my Sea Cadet unit also made sure that my fellow cadets and I had a full grasp of the importance of aviation in modern warfare. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in my discussion of the World Wars, air warfare has its roots in the First World War, first as aerial reconnaissance, then evolving into fighters and primitive bombers. While still primitive in nature, there were a few prominent aviators who came to advocate for a future in which naval or aerial warfare was dominant. One of those was the Italian aviator and World War One veteran Giulio Douhet. He had argued that other forms of warfare were obsolete and that only air power and strategic bombing uh, would uh, determine the outcome of future wars. His theory can be summarized very simply in five key points. First, that there is not any distinction between combatants and non combatants in modern warfare. Second, it is impossible for ground forces to conduct uh, offenses. Third, it is impossible to adequately defend against an aerial offensive due to the speed and elevation advantages that the aircraft naturally has in a three-dimensional environment. Fourth, a nation must be prepared at the beginning of hostilities to conduct massive bombardments of enemy government, population, and industrial centers in order to destroy enemy morale and force them to sue for peace. And fifth, in order to fulfill the previous points, a nation must establish an independent air force to perform these missions and maintain the aircraft at a constant state of readiness. With support from fellow aviators, including American Billy Mitchell and then later the German Herring Göring, air power advocates during the interwar era were convinced that strategic bombing and complete control of the skies would be the sole factor in winning future wars. In their view, bombers were the key airframe for every air force to employ, and the fighters of the First World War legend were to support the former in its missions to bombard enemy targets. Yet during the Second World War, the theories of air power, as professed by Douhet, Mitchell, Goering, and others, were shown to be suspect. While strategic bombing did severely hamper German and later Japanese industrial war production, land and naval forces were still needed to ensure that the Axis powers were defeated. Contrary to the theories presented by Douhet, strategic bombing was not the end all matter of modern warfare, but a contributing aspect. But that did not mean that the failure of strategic warfare meant that aerial warfare had nothing to contribute to the modern battlefield. Close air support, whether from Marine and air units in the Pacific flying from aircraft carriers, or Ju-87 Stuka and P-47 Thunderbolts in the European theater, were crucial aspects of the air support that ground units could expect in modern combat. While the missions of the B 17s over Germany and later the B 29 raids over Japan have become those of legend, it was the close air support missions of single manned airplanes such as the P 47, Ju 87, and other aircraft assigned to support the troops and tanks in the ground that had the greatest impact on the advances of both the Germans in the early years of the Second World War, but also the Allies in their global counteroffensive. Having aircraft that were available to attack targets of opportunity was a key factor in many campaigns. As well, directed air support could mean the difference in an infantry unit's ability to overrun an enemy position. Aircraft carriers and the planes flying from them also changed the nature of naval warfare. It was no longer necessary to sail large fleets of battleships into range of their enemy's guns. Rather, aircraft would scout for and attack the opposing forces from hundreds of miles away. While originally introduced to be a mobile airfield to provide planes to scout for the enemy and fly as spotters for the battleships, by the outbreak of World War II, naval aviation had developed into a crucial platform that could operate in its own task forces. Ironically, it was the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that forced the U.S. Navy to rethink Plan Orange and adapt it to center on the aircraft carrier, not the battleship. By the end of the war, aircraft carriers were the queens of the seas, with their airplanes conducting missions of all sorts: close air support, anti submarine patrols, combat air patrols, scouting, and attacking enemy shipping. While a young aspect of warfare, aerial combat and its theories had developed extremely quickly. By the end of the Second World War, the majority of the fundamentals were in place, and aviators worldwide quickly adapted those tactics and strategies to jets and missiles as they were introduced. The vast majority of Cold War aerial theory came from a U.S. Air Force pilot, Colonel John Boyd. In the 1960s, he helped create the energy maneuverability theory for designing fighter jets and wrote the Aerial Attack Study, which is the U.S. Air Force's dogfighting manual that is still in use today. More importantly, Boyd developed and taught a new way of how to think during combat, using what is known as OODA loops. As seen in this chart on screen, an OODA loop is designed to have the person using it use it for decision making to constantly observe and reorient themselves to the ever changing situation and make quick actions based on these observations. While this was first introduced to the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Marine Corps quickly adopted Boyd's decision making model, and by the end of the Cold War, the use of OODA loops were used by leaders at all levels of the U.S. Defense Department. While aerial combat inside the Earth's atmosphere is now well established, the new frontier for military thought and application is space. While this was ridiculed at that time, Donald Trump, in his first administration, actually did make a wise and correct decision by reorganizing the various space commands that were spread out through the Army, Air Force, and Navy into a singular space force. With our world becoming increasingly reliant on technological aids to assist in our daily lives, the protection of a nation's fleet of communication and navigational satellites will be a crucial factor in a future conflict between two peer rivals. Additionally, being able to track and potentially neutralize an enemy's satellites could be a serious factor in winning a war. As seen before, Elon Musk cut off access to Starlink in Ukraine. Those Starlink internet satellites were used by the Ukrainian forces to give them an advantage over the Russians, as they could use secure internet communication to communicate between their frontline units and command posts, and even communicate with long-range droids. And also, a nation whose air and space forces can control the skies above the battlefield has a disproportionate advantage over the enemy. Using fighters to patrol and defend against enemy aircraft, close air support attack planes to bring in heavy ordnance against a fortified ground target, and bombers to strike at targets well behind enemy lines, reconnaissance planes and drones to report on enemy locations, and communications satellites to connect frontline forces with their commanders allows for dominance on the fields of battle. Thus, over 120 years after the Wright brothers first flew a powered aircraft at Kitty Hawk, aerial combat has quickly evolved into a crucial aspect of modern warfare. And one of the another rapidly development aspect of aerial combat over the past couple of years has been the use of unmanned aerial drones, as demonstrated in the Ukrainian war by both sides, especially with the Ukrainians. Any future war will see the skies just covered with drones from the day combat begins until ceasefire happens, and more. And so, if you're someone out there who's interested in joining, as a teenager who's interested in joining armed services, getting experience flying drones is definitely going to give you a leg up when recruiters from the various armed services come and knock at your door and try and get you to join their service. Moving on to nuclear warfare, one of the key things that did impress me about the Christopher Nolan's Oscar award-winning film Oppenheimer was how he was able to capture the immense power of an atomic bomb detonation and without using CGI. As soon as J. Robert Oppenheimer and his Manhattan Project team's successful tests in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945, military strategy had to factor in a weapon that could easily and quickly end all life on this planet in a matter of hours. Despite Oppenheimer's wish that a public demonstration of an atomic detonation in an unoccupied location be opted for, American wartime leaders, particularly General of the Army Henry Hap Arnold and General Carl Spaatz, and of course, notoriously hot headed strategic bomber commander in the Pacific, Major General Curtis LeMay, sought that the atomic bomb be used against the Japanese home islands directly. As history is recorded, and I made a video on this earlier this year, U.S. President Harry S. Truman, himself a veteran of the trench warfare of the First World War, ultimately made the decision to use the atomic weapons against Japan. First on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then a few days later on August 9th on Nagasaki, thus becoming a major factor in Emperor Hirohito forcing his government to surrender on August 14th of 1945. As the 1940s came to a close, the United States was continuing its development of ever larger atomic weapons, while at the close of the summer of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic weapon, with ever more powerful thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs being developed a few years later. As the world had largely abandoned the concept of using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield fairly early, due to the collateral effects of nuclear fallout that their own troops would suffer from, atomically armed states have focused their efforts on developing strategic weapons that would eliminate their enemies' major military installations, government institutions, cities, and critical infrastructure in a fatal knockout blow, while maintaining enough weapons in reserve in case their territory was attacked first. This became the strategy of nuclear deterrence, also known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And both the United States and Soviet Union would center their strategic policy around their nuclear arsenals for the entirety of the Cold War, which was from the late 1940s all the way up to 1991. To ensure that enough nuclear warheads were available for a first strike and retaliatory counterattack, both the United States and Soviet Union would develop airborne delivered bombs, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and smaller but equally powerful submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs. And this was generally the Americans developing and the Soviets eventually copying the technology. Airdropped nuclear weapons, such as the ones dropped on Japan, were the first developed and the easiest to mass produce during the early years of the Cold War, as both sides would continue to build ever larger strategic bombers up through today. Next, using the space race as a cover, The United States and Russia, with help from recruited German rocket scientists from the Nazi rocket program, would develop missiles that could launch a nuclear warhead on a suborbital trajectory across the planet to their intended target. Finally, as the 1950s came to a close, and independently of the United States Air Force's rocket program, the United States Navy developed and deployed the first SLBMs and began to construct specifically designed submarines to carry those weapons. As the first strike would not be able to target all of the enemy's missiles, as the submarines could hide in the depths for months at a time, and bombers were a constantly moving target, a nation would still have a sizable nuclear counterstrike arsenal available, thus ensuring retaliatory strikes against the attacker. As the 1960s saw the experience of building and maintaining large nuclear arsenals increase, and combined with a thawing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the world entered an era of détente, with the nuclear superpowers actively negotiating to limit the number of weapons available. It should be noted by the 1990s, the United States and the Soviet Union were not the only states possessing nuclear weapons. So too were Great Britain, France, India, Pakistan, and South Africa, with Iran and North Korea having atomic programs in their infancy. It should be noted that since the 1980s, South Africa has voluntarily decommissioned all of their nuclear devices and is now considered a state without nuclear capability. As nuclear weapon technological development has largely ended in the nations that possess them, the last few decades have been focused on developing missile defense systems. While networks of early warning radar systems have been developed globally and been deployed globally since the 1950s, it was only during the late 1970s which weapon systems focused on defending against missiles started being developed. Two of the early and most famous are the United States Army's Patriot missile and the United States Navy's Aegis combat system. The Patriot missile came to prominence during the first Gulf War in 1991, being able to defend American allies against Iraqi missile attacks with great success. Due to that success, the United States Army was able to greenlight the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, system, which uses kinetic force to destroy an enemy missile and has been deployed to key regions of the United States and sold to several American allies who have had a need to defend themselves from attack. Now, what is more impressive is the United States Navy's Aegis combat system, which was originally developed during the 1990s to counter the growing threat of Soviet anti-ship missiles and aircraft. It was quickly found that the system was a perfect fit for defending against nuclear missiles. As the George W. Bush administration saw an increase in funding for missile defense, it discovered that Aegis was a system that could be upgraded for missile defense easily with a software patch, and originally an upgraded RAM 161 Standard Missile 3, SM3, being deployed on those ships. Now, as the years have progressed, the program has become standard on all Flight 3 Arleigh class destroyers, has been a key update, and all Aegis ships still in commission in their first refit that happened after the development of this technology. And the RAM 161 SM3 has slowly been replaced with the newer RAM 174 SM6 standard missile. Additionally, the Aegis Ashore variant has been deployed in a few key positions in the United States and its allies' territory, and has become the foundation for many licensed and copied weapon systems like that. So, as you can tell, the skies and even space have become just full of new technology, new strategies for both using aircraft and missiles, both defensively and in an aggressive offensive manner. And that's, I do see, will continue, especially with more expansion of drones into the skies, as well as satellites becoming armed in the future. So with all that, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like it if you did. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Please share this with someone you think is interested. If you do choose a comment, please be kind to each other. And I will be back next week to conclude the series discussing the development of naval warfare and the key strategies behind that. So until then, I will see you next time. Bye bye.